From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Rishad Salamat in Hong Kong on the spread of the coronavirus. Gina Mountain Adams here in New York on what the virus may mean for corporate earnings. And from Washington, Wendy Benjaminson on who will be in the spotlight at tonight's Democratic presidential debate. So we want to go first to Hong Kong. And first, Rishad, as we lead into this, let me lay out what President Trump says, which is basically Beijing's got it under control. This is what he said earlier today in India.
I've spoken to President Xi, and they're working very hard. And if you know anything about him, I think he'll be in pretty good shape. They've had a rough patch, and I think right now they have it. It looks like they're getting it under control more and more.
So, Rishad, they say it looks like they're getting it under control. Does it look that way from where you stand?
Well, are they getting it under control at the moment? Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, coming out earlier suggesting that if it hadn't been for the information suppression by China in the first place, we wouldn't be in the position that we're in now. We're talking about Austria now, Italy, of course, with something like 50,000 people under lockdown, and the Spanish island of Tenerife. We've got 1,000 people in a hotel locked up there as well, though they're saying it's not formally a quarantine. Don't forget Iran, 15 deaths. Now, biggest cluster of deaths outside of China. Also getting reports possibly an infection in Switzerland. And don't forget South Korea. This is what's going on at the moment. So it's about containment. People are trying their best to do this. The latest to come into this, United Arab Emirates, and also Turkey banning flights to Iran. That's something that they're doing as well. Of course, this is going to have a huge toll when it comes to the global economy. We had the IMF, Gita Gopinath, their chief economist, suggesting that we'll get a shaving of about 0.1% growth this year. But then you take a look at somebody like UBS's chairman, Axel Weber. He's suggesting in this quarter we could actually see the Chinese economy shrink. And he's talking about a global economy in the same time frame, going from 3.5% growth to just 0.5%. So this is where we are at the moment. And, I just did mention what's going on in some of those countries. South Korea, we have 977 people infected there currently. And the thing is, they've seen their consumer confidence numbers. They were out for this month, and they've fallen off a cliff. They're actually down to the lowest in 5 years, and that's when we had the last coronavirus there, which is, of course, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. So, there's all to play for here. And just going back to Italy, this lockdown there, it represents 22% of that country's GDP. That's how much economic activity is and could be stifled as a result of what's happening there. Now, what can people do about it? We've got economists suggesting that we could see something like 205 basis points of cuts from the 7 biggest central banks in the world. Question is, would 25 basis points make a difference here, David? After all, people are fearing for their lives. People are very, very frightened. Will they go out and shop? Will they use that interest rate cut for any benefit? Well, the jury's out, certainly on that.
Yeah, Rishad Salamat, thank you for that comprehensive, if sobering, report on where we are on the coronavirus, reporting from Hong Kong. And now let's come to Gina Martin Adams. And Gina, of course, first and foremost, this is a human tragedy. We never want to forget that. But we're starting to see it now, perhaps hitting some corporations in their earnings forecast.
Yeah, I think that corporates have been very slow to give us a whole lot of information because, like the rest of the world, sort of anticipating the effects of this when we don't even know what the duration of it are is very, very difficult. Nonetheless, you have a handful of companies, less than 30 S&P 500 companies have actually given us guidance. Obviously, the vast majority of those are negative. I think the better way to think about it really is in analyst revisions, where we're seeing the most activity. So analysts are attempting to get a sense of what is the real impact here. And more than 300 companies in the S&P 500 have recorded downward revisions to their first quarter estimates. So we've gone from an anticipation of about 2.5% growth on Q1 to negative growth expected already. I think that's only going to get a little bit worse as long as the coronavirus sort of continues to extend, the duration extends, and it continues to ramp up globally. I think the most sort of damaging impact to the markets of the downward revisions has not just been Q1, but the fact that analysts are now reassessing the outlook for Q2, for Q3, and for the year as a whole. And finally, we're seeing the markets kind of capitulate to the idea that some of the income lost is not going to be made up for in the second half of the year. And that's reflected in the 2020 estimate, which is now going downward.
And it raises questions, for example, in the tech sector, where there will see changes in supply chains and things like that might have longer-term effects on their business.
Yeah, and it's going to be really interesting in the tech sector, especially in the semiconductor space. I was speaking to our analyst, Anand Srinivasan, this morning on this, and he was talking about sort of Q1 is generally lost time in the semiconductor spaces anyway. What you really need to to see is a ramp up in production occur come March, April in anticipation of the third quarter order flow, which really feeds through to fourth quarter holiday seasonality. So you're going to see a lot of seasonal issues in tech. I think the bigger devastation right now is frankly on earnings in the consumer discretionary and the industrial space, where you have real loss of sales that will not be made up for in the second half. And that's where you're seeing the greatest price action with respect to coronavirus, and I think that'll continue.
Yeah, and as you suggest, it's not clear we found bottom yet.
Correct. Absolutely. I don't think we have found bottom because companies are just starting to guide, and we've been through fourth quarter where analysts were trying to sort of assess what the fourth quarter looked like. Now we're starting to focus going forward. Okay, Gina, thank you so very much. That's Gina Martin-Adams reporting here in New York. And now let's go to Washington and Wendy Benjaminson, because there is a big debate tonight, Wendy. The spotlight last time, I think it's fair to say, was on Michael Bloomberg. He is, of course, the founder, majority owner of our parent company, Bloomberg LP. Where's it going to be tonight?
Well, I think the focus might continue to be a little bit on Michael Bloomberg. I certainly don't think Elizabeth Warren is going to let up for a moment. She raised something like $7 million after the debate last week. But I do think that the field will likely turn to Bernie Sanders. He has now won the popular vote in Iowa. He won the New Hampshire primary. He won the Nevada caucuses very well. He is favored to win in California on Super Tuesday. He's doing well in South Carolina, which has its primary on Saturday. And so if there is a Stop Bernie movement, it will be on the stage tonight.
But it's something we haven't seen yet, Wendy. Interestingly, even though he was the front runner before, we haven't seen them really go after Bernie Sanders. Do we think that other people will join with something that we've heard from the Bloomberg camp they want to do, which is turn the spotlight onto Bernie Sanders? Is it possible for the rest of them to get behind that movement?
They may. I don't think they would consider it getting behind that movement, but yes, absolutely. Michael Bloomberg has made it absolutely clear that he is turning all of his firepower on Bernie Sanders, that he has to stop Bernie Sanders. He firmly doesn't, his campaign says he doesn't believe that Bernie Sanders can beat Donald Trump. The others probably will too, because they need to, cut him down a little bit in order for them to gain enough delegates to keep going. Beyond Super Tuesday, which is going to be very difficult. However, the centrists also need to sort of keep cutting down Michael Bloomberg so that his spending advantage is decreased a little bit.
It sounds like that circular firing squad again, potentially.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
It does.
Okay, thank you so much to Wendy Benjamin. She's our political editor reporting today from Washington. And now it's time to find out how the markets are reacting to today's top stories. And joining us once again is Abigail Doolittle. Well, the markets are down. The equity markets are down again. Is it coronavirus again?
Once again, coronavirus, and it's a little bit more bearish than the declines might suggest. We're down about 1%. That is pretty bearish. But what makes it a little bit more bearish than that on first glance is the fact that on the open, we were actually higher. At one point, the stocks, that chip index, up 1.3%. Now we're looking at pretty decent declines, the fourth down day in a row. So this actually really started on Friday with that PMI miss on the services side, the idea that the coronavirus is bleeding into the economy here in the U.S. And as you were just talking about with Gina Martin-Adams and what we are always talking about, will it affect the corporate profit outlook? The answer is yes, but still it's not quantifiable. So as this happens, investors selling stocks and key technical levels simply being sliced through, moving averages, the bears probably are going to take stocks down even more.
It strikes me there's also some risk in lumping it all together under coronavirus. Yesterday, you pointed out that, in fact, health insurers got hit worse than the rest of the people did. That there was some differentiation. There are some other things going on in the marketplace besides just the coronavirus. We might miss those other things.
Well, when you have this sort of a sell-off, and it's the degree of which we had yesterday, it wasn't panic, but it was the worst day that we had in 2 years. You tend to miss the smaller stories because folks simply want out, and that's what we saw. So we have stocks down in a big way, bonds up in a big way, the yen up. That was really the focus. So these smaller side stories get lost in that shuffle as investors seek safety and to get chips off the table, essentially.
Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much for reporting on the markets. And now it's time to go to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, Congress is expected to grill U.S. health officials this week on the coronavirus outbreak and what the United States is doing to prevent the virus from taking hold here. The White House has asked Congress for $2.5 billion to battle the disease. Bloomberg has learned that some officials feel the U.S. response hasn't been aggressive enough, while others worry that placing too many restrictions could hurt the U.S. economy. President Trump is optimistic there will be a deal with the Taliban to formally end the war in Afghanistan. The president spoke at a news conference in New Delhi.
We're pretty close. We'll see what's going on. We've got 2 days now under our belt. without violence, or I guess a minimum of violence.
American and Taliban leaders plan to sign a peace deal Saturday. That's if a week-long reduction in violence that began last Saturday stays in place. In India, a new citizenship law that excludes Muslims has triggered more violence. Hindus carrying pickaxes and iron tools hurled rocks at Muslims in New Delhi today. Yesterday, at least 7 people were killed, more than 100 others were injured. India has been racked by violence since Parliament approved a new citizenship law in December that provides fast-track naturalization for some foreign-born religious minorities, but not for Muslims. Former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak is dead. He was 91. Mubarak ruled for 30 years before being forced out of office by the Arab Spring uprising in 2011. He went on trial for the killing of more than 850 protesters by his security forces. Mubarak was only found guilty of fraud. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, triggered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, we're going to go live to Charleston, South Carolina for a preview of tonight's big debate. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Democratic presidential candidates are returning to the debate stage tonight, this time in Charleston, South Carolina, ahead of the state's primary coming up this Saturday. And our very own chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli, is on the scene in Charleston, and this is what's coming up. Tell us all about it, Kevin. What should we be looking for?
A lot of fire against Senator Bernie Sanders, who now assumed his official frontrunner status after winning over the weekend in the Nevada caucus. Expect many of the campaigns to specifically target him and comments that he made as it relates to Cuban's Fidel Castro. Beyond that, former Vice President Joe Biden really saying that his campaign is putting all of their money in South Carolina, being bolstered, he hopes, in part by the large African-American community here that he feels will back his campaign ahead of that contest this weekend. And that's just a couple of days before Super Tuesday. So this is really the final pitch that many of the campaigns will have to make their pitch to voters. And one more word about Bernie Sanders. Last night in a CNN town hall, he was asked point blank if he doesn't receive the 1991 delegates that are needed to officially clinch the Democratic nomination, would he still feel, if he leads in delegates, that he deserves to be the nominee? He said that if he gets a quote-unquote plurality of delegates, he feels that that person should, in fact, be the Democratic nominee. So already some jockeying about that specific 1991 number, David, as it relates to delegates.
Son of a gun. Okay, thanks so much to Kevin Cirilli reporting from Charleston. And a reminder, Bloomberg Radio will have full coverage of the debate with Kevin hosting coming up this evening. For more on tonight's debate, we welcome now our political panel of Amy Tarkanian. She's former chairwoman of the Nevada State Republican Party, and Basil Smikle, former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party. So welcome, both of you. Good to have you here.
Thank you.
Basil, let me start with you. What are you expecting to look for out of that debate tonight, and how critical is it that Joe Biden show up?
Well, it's essentially do or die for Joe Biden.
Yeah.
I think if he doesn't win South Carolina, he is significantly hobbled going into Super Tuesday on a day when two of the biggest of the most delegate-rich states in the country will vote, California and Texas, which Bernie Sanders is projected to win, largely because of their Latino population and his support there. So I think Joe Biden has to win the debate tonight. He has to win in South Carolina. But the truth is, I think all eyes are going to be on Bernie Sanders. He's the front runner now. So I think, and you even heard Pete Buttigieg after the Nevada caucuses spend most of his speech talking about Bernie Sanders. So I do think you'll see a lot of attacks on him. I think Mike Bloomberg, my guess is that he'll have a better debate than he did last week, but I think Bernie Sanders is going to be the focus of a lot of attention.
We'll come back to Mike Bloomberg in a minute, but let's talk about Bernie Sanders just for a minute. Bernie Sanders is talking about Bernie Sanders, and he's not backing off some of his positions. For example, on Fidel Castro, this is part of what he said.
We're very opposed to the authoritarian nature of Cuba. But, it's unfair to simply say everything is bad. When Fidel Castro came into office, you know what he did? He had a massive literacy program. Is that a bad thing?
So he taught a lot of people how to read. That's on 60 Minutes from CBS. I mean, at the same time, he doesn't seem to be more vulnerable for taking these positions.
which is actually terrifying in my opinion. This literacy program that he is claiming that was established underneath Castro is false, because they already had a very high literacy rate and they already had a program in place prior to that regime. You know, this is a man who kills his own people, who puts his own people into concentration camps, so to speak. These are people who literally make maybe $300 a year. I don't think that we would be seeing people trying to escape in rafts by the droves if this was such a wonderful environment.
But that doesn't seem to bother many Democratic voters, Basil.
You know,
they're voting for him.
Listen, we can have a long conversation about Cuba, but the truth is there are a lot of voters that are going to look past it because whatever remarks he made took place a long time ago. Even Barack Obama tries to normalize relations with Cuba. So there is a more robust conversation that folks need to have about it. That said, I do think he needs to talk more about how he's going to pay for the policies that he's proposing. On the other side, the energy that he's getting is largely because of what he's proposing. He wants health care for everybody. He wants to make college affordable for everybody. Who's going to be against that? But he's got to talk about how he's going to do it. That's what's more important. And just very quickly, specifically to Cuba, I think Joe Biden said that he'll probably lose Florida as a result of that. That actually is a little concerning to me in a general election, specifically. But, you know, nobody's going to take support away from Bernie Sanders.
Amy, I do want to talk about Michael Bloomberg, who, of course, is the founder and the majority shareholder of our parent company, Bloomberg LP. I think it's fair to say he did not have a good first outing. That may be an understatement.
Very fair to share.
What does he need to do tonight?
Well, I hope that he did his debate prep. He can only go up from his last performance. It was very, very apparent that he did not prepare himself. I think that was maybe a little bit of arrogance on his part to just walk in thinking that it was going to be a cakewalk. If you're going to go up against President Trump, who is quick-witted, very sharp, with the tongue at times, you need to know your issues inside and out. And I'm hoping that tonight it's a little bit more I don't want to say entertaining. It would be entertaining for me to see a repeat of that last debate, but it would be nice to see that he actually did a little bit of homework.
Basil, finally, if it's not going to be Bernie Sanders, if for some reason it's not Bernie Sanders, do some of the moderates have to drop out?
Oh, absolutely. If it's not Bernie, my theory has always been Bernie Sanders and Mike Bloomberg have the money, the motivation, and the operation to go the distance. What's going to have to happen is someone, whether it's President Obama, and I'm not previewing that, I'm just saying it has to be President Obama, the donors, or some of the unions, go to these candidates and say, you know what, you all need to drop out. We need to get behind one candidate as an alternative to Bernie Sanders, if it comes to that, some moderate, if it comes to that. That might be Biden, that might be Mike Bloomberg, I don't know, but that conversation is going to have to happen sooner rather than later. I thought Amy Klobuchar was going to drop out the other night. It sounded like it.
Nobody seems inclined in that direction, I must say.
I think, first of all, Vice President Biden needs to understand that he's running for president and not for Senate like he announced today. That would be a good start.
It was unfortunate. Okay, many thanks to our political panel, Amy Tarkanian and Basil Smikle. And tune in to our special coverage of the Super Tuesday election. That's going to be coming up 1 week from today, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Still ahead, part of our conversation with Mark Calabria. He's director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. This is Bloomberg Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now to check on the health of the housing market. We've been talking with the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, Mark Calabria. He sat down with Bloomberg's Michael McKee about the future of Fannie and Freddie and more.
So we can, by statute, already fix Fannie and Freddie and release them from conservatorship. We can't fix the basic model. So I have the model I have. I can do what I can to get them back out and try to make sure they don't get back in by being better capitalized. But there are some real fundamental flaws to the model that only Congress can fix.
Will you be going to Congress with proposals to try to get them?
Yes, we will. We will be asking for bigger changes, such as I think that the consumer benefits from competition. You know, I've asked for chartering authority to be able to issue additional charters. This also has the benefit of not ever bringing competition, but it also helps reduce too big to fail. You know, we've got two of these entities. We're really dependent on them. If we had 5 or 6 or 7, then any 1 or 2 of them could get in trouble, and you'd be less likely to have to rescue them.
You've talked about reducing risk in their models and in their portfolios. If you did that, would you need them?
Well, ultimately, I think that you can strengthen them and make sure that they're safe and sound. So to me, the primary purpose of Fannie and Freddie is to be a countercyclical liquidity. So at a time of stress, they're a floor under the market. That's going to be important even for good quality loans. And historically, it really was only to the 90s that the credit quality at Fannie and Freddie really started to decline. So they have an important role. I think they have an important role that can support quality lending, and we want to make sure that that's what they're focused on.
Well, in terms of their role, what's your goal? It used to be that we wanted everybody to own a house. Where are we?
Well, that hasn't changed, but what's different and what I think is important is we want the home ownership to be sustainable. We saw last time where we got a lot of people in at the top of the market, and they got wiped out, lost a lot of wealth, lost their jobs, found themselves underwater. So what we're really focused on is that the home ownership that Fannie and Freddie and the Federal Home Loan Banks are providing is sustainable home ownership so that we get somebody in, they're in to stay. We know this is going to be a success story.
Let's talk about the timetable for getting them out. You're talking about it as a 2021 event?
Well, I also want to emphasize first, it's process dependent, not calendar dependent. So I'm not circling a date where we're pushing them out. What we're focused on is the things that we need to do. I think will at least take us another year to do the things we needed to build up Fannie and Freddie, to build up the agency. So there was an agency, we're ready for an exit. So there are a lot of pieces that need to be put in place. I would love if we could do a big capital raise today, but we're just not in that position yet.
That was Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Staying with the housing area, our stock of the hour is Home Depot, heading for its best day since August. The stock is up nearly 2% after the company beat estimates in the fourth quarter, and Kaylee Lyons is here to explain how they did it.
Yeah, it's a nice upside surprise for the market today, given last quarter Home Depot took down its guidance and sent shockwaves through the market. Today, though, they surprised with the upside, earnings of $2.28, coming in about 17 cents above the estimate. And they also surprised on same-store sales, which grew 5.2%. The street was expecting just 4.7% growth. And really what Home Depot has to thank for that is the strong housing market. We're in a low-rate environment, cheaper mortgages mean people are out buying houses. And not only that, home prices are higher, and people are much more likely to invest in home improvement if they think they're going to get a better return on their investment. So Home Depot definitely benefiting from that.
Any effect of coronavirus, or is this relatively immune?
It is relatively immune, considering most of its stores are in North America. The impact would be in the supply chain, because about 30% of its goods are sourced outside of the U.S., a big chunk of that in China. So that could be where it shows up, as well as any economic slowdown that may trickle down into the housing market and Home Depot's customers.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much to Kaylee Lyons for that report on Home Depot. Coming up next, she served as the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. That's the co-sponsor of tonight's Democratic debate. We talk with Congresswoman Marcia Fudge of Ohio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, President Trump's trying to ease fears about the coronavirus spreading throughout the United States. Speaking at a news conference in India today, the president said the situation is, quote, very well under control in our country. On Monday, the Trump administration asked Congress for an additional $2.5 billion to prepare in case of a widespread outbreak and to help other nations. Hillary Clinton has expressed her skepticism about Bernie Sanders, but says she will support whomever becomes the Democratic nominee. The former Secretary of State and Democratic nominee, who beat Sanders for the nomination in 2016, criticized him in the new documentary Hillary, saying, quote, nobody likes him, nobody wants to work with him. Speaking at a film festival in Berlin today, Clinton said her top priority is seeing President Trump defeated in November. The European Union's chief Brexit negotiator is handing British Prime Minister Boris Johnson an ultimatum. Michel Barnier is warning that there will be no trade deal unless the UK agrees to the bloc's demands for fair competition and fishing. Barnier spoke in Brussels days before the two sides are due to open formal trade negotiations. An investigation has found that opera superstar Placido Domingo had inappropriate activity with women. The probe was conducted by a performers union in the United States, and it prompted Domingo to issue his fullest apology yet. His 5-decade American career was put on hold last year by allegations of sexual misconduct. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Marcia Fudge has served as the Democratic congresswoman from Ohio for 12 years, representing a district that includes much of Cleveland and Akron. She was the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus in the 113th Congress, and she joins us today from Charlotte, South Carolina, where the Black Caucus is a co-sponsor of tonight's debate. So, Madam Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us. Let me start with the most basic question. As a Democrat, what do you hope to get out of tonight's debate and the primary coming up on Saturday? What will be a success for the Democratic Party?
A success for me tonight would be that the candidates address the issues that affect people from South Carolina and other places, but in particular, South Carolina. We are here. We need to talk about issues like education and poverty. We need to talk about issues that affect everyday people. I hope that that's what happens, that we don't get caught up in things that are not really at the root of what we believe in. We need to talk about gun control. We're across the street from Emmanuel, where the shooting took place some years ago. We need to talk about who stands with us to make our neighborhood safer and who don't. So I'm hopeful that we will really burrow down and talk about what affects people in South Carolina.
And perhaps more poignantly, where the candidates may differ on some of those issues. There have been some issues raised, for example, with respect to Bernie Sanders and his record on gun control and gun legislation. Is it something that could differentiate the candidates one from the other?
No question about it. In the House, we passed what we called getting rid of the Charleston loophole. Bernie Sanders voted against it. We probably could be suing gun manufacturers today, but Bernie Sanders voted against it. And so I think that it is important to, as you say, make a clear distinction as to where people stand. And I do believe that if the questions are asked properly, then we will get that distinction tonight.
So you have taken a position, it was about 11 months ago now, in fairness, in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, that you actually had some reservations about Bernie Sanders. You said in part, I'm not sure somebody far left can win. I might be wrong. I'm about as liberal as they come, but I'm also pragmatic and understand how government runs too. I would love it if a far left liberal could win, but I don't think that's going to happen. And you went on to say specifically about Bernie Sanders you had doubts. Have you changed your mind?
I've not. I do believe that this country is center-left. It is not left-left. It is center-left. And I do believe that the candidate that we choose that can win must be center-left as well. Because I think that that then brings into place the kind of coalition that it takes to beat Donald Trump. It becomes a large, as we say, big tent. That is the Democratic Party. Now, I do understand that there are some diversity in places that we've already been. But when you talk about a national election, it is very different than a state election. And so I'm hopeful that our candidate will be someone that is more center-left.
And one of the issues, of course, that we talk about with South Carolina is the African-American population. We have Hispanics, fairly substantial in Nevada. We had a very small minority representation in both Iowa and New Hampshire. What are the issues that you think, from your point of view, appeal specifically to African-Americans across the country?
Well, let me just make one distinction about Nevada. Yes, Nevada is diverse, but when you vote in a caucus, less than 5% of the electorate vote. I do not think it's a good representation of the people in the state. It is difficult, it is undemocratic, and so I would make that distinction first. But I would say what people in South Carolina want to hear is, what are you going to do to make my life better? What are you going to do for me? What are you going to do for my family? What are you going to do for my community? How does my vote for you make my life better?
Looking forward to the primary coming up, we see polls that indicate that Joe Biden, the former vice president, is ahead. Is that your sense of the state at this point?
It is my sense at this point. I mean, you got to realize that the vice president has a long history with people in South Carolina. He used to vacation here. He was here an awful lot during the presidency of Barack Obama. I think that it is important that people know him, and that's what helps him. I mean, certainly most of us vote for people that we either like or we believe in their policies. And I think for South Carolina, Joe Biden probably hits both of those.
Play this forward, if we're willing, to Milwaukee, actually, in July. There's been talk about what would happen if someone like a Bernie Sanders went in with a plurality, substantial plurality, but less than a majority. What would happen to a convention like that? Are you concerned about pulling the party back together again in that sort of scenario?
I'm really not, because if people forget that Hillary Clinton 4 years ago went in with a majority, with the number of votes necessary to win, but Mr. Sanders still took it to a vote. So, I mean, you can't have it one way now and another way at another time. You have to follow the rules. So I believe that the rules are set in place, and I think that they're going to work.
And finally, you serve as the chair of the Subcommittee on Elections of the House Administrative Committee.
Yes.
There's now some reports about possible intelligence indicating that the Russians may be trying to interfere in the elections again. Some might be favoring Bernie Sanders, some might be favoring President Trump. What do you know about that, and what are we doing? Should we be doing more to try to prevent that?
There's no question but that we should be doing more. But it also starts at the top. The president needs to admit that Russia meddled in his election 4 years ago and is meddling in this one. It is indisputable. Our intelligence people have said it, but if the president refuses to accept our own intelligence, I don't know where we are as a country when you decide that you're going to do away with whatever makes sense with the judiciary. You're going to put people on courts that are not qualified. You're going to ignore the advice of our intelligence community. We are lost. And so I think the only thing that can happen now is for the Congress to step up and pass the kinds of legislation that requires us to do more. We know that they are attacking African Americans in particular. We know that they are targeting people who are poor in particular because they are trying to keep us from voting. That's what suppression is.
Well, some of what we saw in 2016 specifically, as you say, involved the African-American community and misrepresentations of people who claimed that they were African-Americans. And in fact, it appears they were, in fact, Russians. As I understand it, Congress appropriated a fair amount of money after 2016 to try to address some of those issues. Are we better off today than we were then?
Oh, certainly I think we are better off. I mean, because we know what they're doing. We've done a lot more intel. We have a lot more information. Yes, we are better off, but we are not good enough. We have done some, but we need to do more. Because if we do not, what we will find is that we're going to have more interference than we had in 2016. And I think the president is concerned, quite frankly, that he is not a legitimate president today. So he does not want to admit that they are those who are continuing to meddle in this election.
Okay, Congressman, thank you so much for your time. Really good to be with you. That is our Democratic Representative Marcia Fudge of Ohio. She's down in Charleston, South Carolina. Coming up here, income inequality weighs on the economy and on the electorate as we head into an election year. But what can be done? We talk with Rajiv Shah. He is president of the Rockefeller Foundation about their work on the subject and the solutions they've come up with. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Income inequality in the United States has grown by just about every measure over the last generation. But President Trump, in his State of the Union address, claimed that things were getting better under his administration.
The unemployment rate for African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans has reached the lowest levels in history. African American youth unemployment has reached an all-time low. African American poverty has declined to the lowest rate ever recorded.
We welcome now someone who has taken on the task of assessing income inequality, its causes, its effects, and what can be done about it. Rajiv Shah is the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, a position he assumed after serving as the head of USAID under President Obama. He joins us from Washington for today's conversation in chief. So thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it. You heard what the president had to say. Give us your assessment right now of where income inequality is in the United States. Is it, in fact, getting better?
Well, thank you, David, for having me and for tackling this really important subject. The reality is we know that across Democratic and Republican administrations over the last 4 decades, income inequality has gotten much, much worse in the United States. And the result of that is that in that prior era, more than 40 years ago, the corporate profit share of GDP was roughly 5%. It's doubled to 10% now. And we've seen a commensurate, almost exact reduction in the share of GDP that goes to workers through wages. We have an economy that really does reward capital and really does punish wage labor. And that's why nearly 40% of American households don't have $400 to handle an emergency, feel like they're falling behind every week, every month, and can't be hopeful about their children's futures. That's not the kind of America we want to live in. And we need practical solutions to address that.
In order to address the solutions, and I want to get to those very shortly here, but in order to, we need to understand the causes, I think. To what extent, from your analysis and looking at the data, how much of that is government policy and how much of that is things like technology, the shift toward technology, which doesn't require as many workers at as high a rate? How much of it is globalization because of comparative advantage around the world?
Yeah, I think there are three major causes. One is globalization. The rise of a global middle class has, without question, put downward pressure on U.S. wage labor over the last several decades, and we've seen that unequivocally. A second is, in fact, as you note, the reality that tax policy in particular has been increasingly unfair. It is now the reality that 400 billionaires in America pay the least effective tax rate of any population in this nation. It was not like that 40 or 50 years ago, and it's like that now. Even in the last tax bill, we saw that the reduction in corporate tax rates have yielded an actual realized share of corporate tax collections that's probably going to come in at 10 or 11%. Which is extraordinarily low by historic standards. So both work together. Technology is, of course, a cause. But right now, in a very hot economy, there are actually jobs available. People are working. Unemployment is low. The issue is 40% of those jobs don't allow the families in those households to have enough food on the table, to afford prescription drugs, to be able to cover education costs, and really to be hopeful about their own children's futures.
So we heard the president there saying that, in fact, the real wages are increasing for some of the lower portions of the economic scale, which all the numbers out of the Fed suggest. Some people say it's because of minimum wage law increases state by state. How much are minimum wages really a solution to the problem?
Well, the inflation-adjusted increase in wages at the bottom of the U.S. labor market is roughly around 9% and over the last few years. And if you look over the last 40 years, it's still probably negative. Actually, Joe Stiglitz has suggested it's a negative 3% across a 40-year time frame. So it is a safe statement to make to say that America's workers have not received a raise in 40 years. And in that time frame, basic expenses for education costs, healthcare costs, housing in particular, have skyrocketed. And whereas it used to take 30 weeks of labor work to cover your basic needs, today it takes 53. And that's why the Rockefeller Foundation is basically making a $65 million investment in partners around the nation to identify solutions that we think can work at scale, and can help tens of millions of low-wage workers in this country meet their basic needs and be hopeful about mobility and upward mobility for their children's futures.
Let's talk about one of those solutions that's discussed quite a bit, which is the Earned Income Tax Credit. What's your assessment of where we are on that, and is that part of the solution?
Well, it's absolutely part of the solution. In fact, I like reminding my colleagues that this was a policy that has true bipartisan history and support. It was introduced by Richard Nixon as a negative income tax, embraced and expanded by Reagan, picked up by Clinton and Obama, and it is the #1 policy in America for addressing poverty. It works very simply. If you have a job, you earn income, and you can't make ends meet, you can apply for the Earned Income Tax Credit. On average, you get about $3,300 of support a year, and that helps mostly women-headed households with children pay for childcare, pay for health care, improve educational outcomes for kids. No American policy has been studied more carefully, and without question, it is the most effective way to both address poverty amongst the working poor in America and to create better outcomes for children from a childcare, healthcare, and education perspective. So we have data. We know it works. We believe it could be doubled or expanded aggressively at the federal level, and there's a tremendous amount of innovation at the state and local level where they're finding ways to adapt it to make it even more useful as a real tool to help 30 or 40 million Americans protect themselves and have the resources to invest in their children's future.
If we doubled it at the federal level, how much would that cost?
That would cost about $60 billion a year, which would be over 10 years, roughly, $600 billion. And by the way, if you put that in context, the last Trump tax cut was a $2.3 trillion tax cut over 10 years, as scored by the Congressional Budget Office, and 83% of those gains went to the top 1%. Had we taken just a share of that and invested it in America's working families, we would see much better outcomes for children, their studies, their learning, their futures. And those are the kinds of investments that we need to be discussing and debates we need to be having about how can we invest in people and not just markets to lift up the 40% of America's population that really has lost faith that their children are going to do better than them. They've lost faith in the American dream, and it doesn't have to be that way.
We're talking with Rajiv Shah. He's the Rockefeller Foundation president. You went exactly to the question I was going to ask, which is, I like to distinguish, if I can, in federal expenditures, whether they're expenses or they're investments. And if this is investment, actually, in the earned income tax credit, if that's an investment, particularly in the children and their future productivity, what's the return on the investment? Are there numbers that suggest how much more those people would make and actually return into the economy?
There absolutely are. We've seen the upward economic mobility. The statistic you just showed that we used to in the United States, when my parents immigrated to this country in the late 60s, 90% of kids born in America were going to do better than their parents. Today, it's less than 50%. It used to be the case that 50% of America's kids born into poverty would end up in the middle class. Today, it's probably 20-25%, in that range. So policies like the Earned Income Tax Credit have been studied extensively. We have supported innovations at the state and local level, and we've supported those studies. So we know they work, and we've also seen the ability to bring bipartisan support to expand them. For example, we helped support a coalition in California that supported a major expansion of it last year. In Maine, a very different state than California, did the same. Now it's on the docket in a red state like Missouri and a blue state like Illinois. And when you see that kind of innovation and you see that commitment and the research and data at the state and local level, it does make you wish that our federal political dialogue was more focused and more successful.
Yeah, we want to talk to you about that some more in just a short time. That's Rajiv Shah. He's Rockefeller Foundation president. I'm delighted to say we're going to hear more from Rajiv Shah next, in the next hour on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio. Coming up here, U.S. stocks are extending their slide, putting the S&P on pace for its biggest four-day slump since December of 2018. But President Trump is warning it could just get worse if he's not reelected. More on that ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Continued bad news about the coronavirus is sending equity markets down again today, though not nearly as much as yesterday. But speaking from India, President Trump said the reaction to COVID-19 was nothing compared to what would happen if a Democrat beats him in November.
When we win re-election, I think we will. When we win, I think the market's going to go up like it's going to be like a rocket ship, like last time, but even more so. I think the fact that the Democrats are so radical, so out of control, they honestly don't know what they're doing. If I don't win, you're going to see a crash like you've never seen before. I really mean it.
For an update on the markets and what appears to be driving them, welcome back now, Abigail Doolittle. So is it the fear of the Democrats, I guess?
Well, that's certainly an interesting narrative there. And in fact, there are a few people out there who are talking about the idea that yesterday's market sell-off could have had something to do with Bernie Sanders' big win in Nevada. I would respectfully disagree, though, with the president on this. And in particular, he didn't name Sanders, but the radical and the idea that it was somehow going toward that democratic socialism branch. I would respectfully disagree. It seems as he's more taking advantage of the market sell-off to perhaps float faulty logic in terms of stocks go down, crazy Democrats. So if, when he's running later this year, perhaps against Sanders, he can continue to have that idea out there. But the reason that the stock market sell-off seems to have more to do with the coronavirus, first of all, it didn't start yesterday. It started last Thursday, and then it really picked up speed with greater than 1% declines on Friday on that market PMI miss. And then the coronavirus really worsened over the weekend, and so we had the big sell-off yesterday. Second of all, it was a synchronized global stock market sell-off.
Exactly.
I have a hard time believing the Kospi in Korea is down 4% on Bernie Sanders, or the European markets having their worst day in 4 years on Bernie Sanders. And third, the degree of the stock market sell-off. When Bernie Sanders won the New Hampshire primary on February 11th, on February 12th, the stock market was up. So it's very hard to believe. Now, one point that perhaps makes this, you were kind of hinting at it earlier, the managed care stocks yesterday, they were down about 8%. So they did underperform. But if you take the case that investors were playing those stocks for the idea that they're only going to go higher because Bernie Sanders isn't going to win, you have a stock market sell-off, you put it together, you're going to have greater declines.
Yeah, at the same time, the president's going to have some explanation if the market really keeps going down.
Yeah, it could hurt his chances for sure, because a strong economy, strong market would help a sitting president. The opposite could hurt.
Yeah, and people are starting to ask questions about exactly how they're handling it in Washington as well.
Yes, indeed.
That'll ramp
Policy,
up.
and of course, we'll be hearing from Federal Reserve Vice Chair Richard
Richard
Clarida
Clarida
today. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not this meets the standard for some sort of an emergency rate cut.
Whether the Fed can bail us out again. Okay, many thanks to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. Coming up on Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we'll talk more with Rajiv Shah, Rockefeller Foundation president. We're going to talk more about exactly what can be done about income inequality and how it fits with the presidential race ongoing even as we speak. Do any of the candidates have positions that might address it from his point of view? That's coming up. In the meantime, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.